Actually, this is a story that I want to do in Bynum one night. And I want to do this story. I want Carol Payne to do this story, and I want Marilyn Ellis to do this story. Y'all will understand why when I get done. This is about a river rescue, and it started out with Carol. She had to take her dog Jack to the vet down here at Pittsboro Animal Hospital when Dr. Corey was there. And she was sitting there in the waiting room waiting to take Jack in, and she happened to look up on the bulletin board, and there was a boxer, said, lost dog. And the dates that had been missing, the phone number. And she noticed it because when she was a child, her favorite dog was a boxer. She loves boxers. And she looked at it and admired the sign, as you do is when you're sitting in a waiting room and ain't got nothing else to read. And then went on with Jack and got his shots or whatever and come on home. And then a little bit later, she went and took Sam and her other dog, Sam and Jack, out for a walk down the river. And when she got about a 3/4 of a mile south of Bynum there's an old ferry spot. We call it the swimming hole now. But there's a place where the ferry used to be back in the olden days before the Civil War, before the bridge was built. The old bridge was built in Bynum. It actually, in Bynum, where the pedestrian bridge is now, there was a wooden covered bridge there. Civil War era and before. But before that, there was a ferry about 3/4 of a mile downriver, and the old trail that goes by my house in Bynum is the old road that went down to the old ferry. And she gets there, and there's an island that comes to a point right there, and there was a boxer out on the island, and it was barking and 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 barking. And she's like, it had a distinctive white crest on its chest, and you can see it clearly on the island, but it's from here to the, probably up to the City Tap, far from across the river. And there's no way you could get to it because the water was running high. It was springtime. And the river was up just a little bit, and it had rained that afternoon. It was raining some more, and the river was actually rising. And so it's where the ferry used to be. It's where we go swimming now because it's really deep. You can't touch bottom if you wanted to there. And there was that dog out on the island and barking and barking and barking. She's like, that looks like the dog picture I saw at the vet. So sure enough, she goes back down there to Pittsboro Animal Hospital. She looks at the picture and she's like, yeah. And so she calls the phone number, and the fella answers, and he's at work. And he's like, oh my gosh, well, we live on the other side of the river between 64 and the Hall River near Lowe's over there, and the building supply place. And it was what the dog he called Harley. And the dog's real name was Dodo, because Dodo had been a puppy mill dog, and he had been rescued, but he had spent the first 3/4 of his life in a cage at a puppy mill. So Dodo was not the smartest animal in the puppy mill. He was not the smartest animal to, even if he had had a good chance in his beginning of his life, we don't think Dodo would have ever, been like Lassie or something. But the fellow hated the name Dodo, so he had changed his name for his purposes to Harley. We thought, that's a good name for a boxer, Harley. That's a good old boy name, Harley, Here, Harley, here, Harley. But Carol sees the dog, sees the picture, she calls the guy, and he's like, yeah, that sounds like Harley, and I bet that's him. And he's like, well, okay, so they make an arrangement to meet in the mill parking lot at the trailhead, which is just right below my house there in Bynum, right on the Hall River, at 5 o'clock. And she comes by my house, It was a Friday afternoon, and she's going to meet this guy that she doesn't know, that just happens to have a dog, but, still, she didn't know him. And she's going to be meeting him like an hour and a half before dark and be walking almost a mile down a trail by herself with this fellow. So she stops by my house and said, Cindy, would you mind meeting me meeting this guy with me? And I'm like, oh, yeah, sure. I'll be your muscle. I've got my cell phone right here. I had one of the first cell phones that came out, and it was actually it wasn't the first like flip phone that came out. It was the first smartphone that came out. It was a Kia Ceira 630. The Kia Ceira 630, it had data. It was pre-Palm Pilot, y'all. It had data. It was pre-BlackBerry, y'all. It was pre-Siri. It had data. You could dial into a modem and like shop online on Amazon on it, as long as you dialed into a modem, because there was no, and it didn't have Wi-Fi. That's how old it was. But it was about that thick, and it weighed about 4 pounds, and you flipped it open, and it had a little screen, and you used swipe. The Palm Pilot people stole swipe from Kia Ceira, because it was the swipe. So instead of typing everything with thumbs like we do now, you swiped your finger. Like a T was that, and a J was that. It's fairly easy to figure out swipe. Much faster than typing with your thumbs now, like we do now. So I had my Kia Ceira smartphone, and the distinctive part about that was it got a cell signal when nobody else did. Everybody else had these little bitty tiny flip phones, and you'd have to go stand outside and stand on your head or get near a window and jump up and down and sometimes dial the phone number and hold it up. And the Kia Ceira, I could sit in my bathroom. I could sit in the bathroom at the Health Sciences Library and make a phone call and never lose a signal. Well, down there in Bynum along the river, 3/4 of a mile, it still picked up a signal. Because me and Carol met that fella at the trail parking lot. He's a nice enough guy, seems to be. In fact, he happens to be a deputy sheriff. We didn't know that. And so we walked down the river trail with him, and he's talking about this dog and how he got it, and how it was a puppy mill dog, and how, bless his heart, Dodo was not very bright. But he had renamed him Harley, and he was hopeful that he was going to learn how to be a regular dog. And we get down to the ferry landing swimming hole, and bless his heart, it was Harley. It was his dog. But here it is, like an hour and 15 minutes before dark, Friday evening, 5:15, and we're in a state park. Right below my house down there on the river trail, there's a big old huge gate that's almost as long as this stage. The pole going across that gate is bigger than my leg right there. And it's got a big old huge padlock on it that's about this, it's like Wyatt Earp got locked up in jail. That was the kind of lock that they would use for it. And so he takes my Kia Ceira 630, and I show him how to dial, and he's like, man alive, this phone looks like you could call NASA on it. And I said, you can. And I said, not only can you call NASA, you can download pictures from the International Space Station on it. And I started talking about all the things, the Kia Ceira 630, and I'm like, I'm sorry, you need to call the state parks. So he calls the park rangers out here at Jordan Lake that manage the Lower Hall Natural Resource Area. And they said, well, I'm sorry, it's 5:15. We've already closed. It's Friday afternoon. Call us back at 8:30 in the morning. We'll come help you get the dog off. We'll come unlock the gate so you can get the dog off the island. And he's like, but it's raining, and the dog is on an island that's only like a foot above water, and the river's rising, and it's going up. And I'm like, I can download the data from the river gauge and from the what is that? The Nat Geo site? Whatever's that site? What's the river gauge site? I can't remember, y'all. What? USGS. I could download the river data and tell them exactly when the Hall River at Bynum was going to crest. With my Kia Ceira 630. But no need to show out, So anyway, but the state park ranger or whoever answered the phone, maybe it was just a hired hand, whoever, this person we called and that answered the phone at the state park office just blew the fella off. It didn't matter that the dog was on an island and he might possibly drown, and that he had been missing for 5 days, and that he was a puppy mill dog and probably didn't know how to hunt mice or eat grasshoppers. He was out there on that island, and he was still barking and barking and barking and barking. And so the fella is, just about in tears. And he's like, well, let me call my buddies and see if maybe we could tote a boat down here and get it in the river and go across and get to the island. And, I mean, a boat? We're talking about Class 3 and Class 4 rapids here. We're talking about people with canoes won't put in at that river when it starts flooding. People with kayaks will do it to a point, but it gets beyond 7 or 8 feet. They won't even go in. And we were already like 7.5, or getting close to 8 feet high on the river. 11 feet is flood stage, by the way, in case you all need to know that. Put that in your memory bank so you'll remember. In case you don't have a Kyocera 630 and can't look up the USGS website or the International Space Station. I'm digressing, I'm sorry. So anyway, this fella, the deputy sheriff, he was born and bred Chatham County fella. He gets on the phone and he calls his buddies. And I don't know how many of y'all are, well, I do know how many of y'all are country. But the ones of you that are our country will agree with me. Country people know how to do things with nothing. We know how to make cars out of pieces and parts we find along the road. We know how to build a house with junk that we find in Dipsy dumpsters. We can make supper with grease, flour, and that's all we really need is grease and flour. We can make supper. I'll tell y'all how after a while. So he calls his country buddies. I don't want to really call them redneck, but they had a redneck tendency, let's put it that. And he calls his buddies, his country fellas, and in 25 minutes, there was 40 fellas there. I actually went back up to the house to feed my cats, because my cats have to be fed between 5:30 and 6:30 p.m., or there's World War III breaking out and there is bloodshed. So I went back up to the house to feed the cats, and the neighbor across the street, his name is Aaron. He's a computer geek. He worked up there at Performance Bicycle and did all the database stuff up there. He come by my house and knocked on the door and said, Cindy, there's about 40 fellas down there at the river. And he says, they've got bolt cutters. And that padlock on that state park gate has already been cut. Aaron was not a country boy, but he was impressed. And he just looks at me, and it was one of those moments that's the part of the story you can hang your hat on. He looked at me and he said, it's going to be a show. I immediately put the used cat food cans in the recycle bin, and I got my Kyocera 630, and I took off back down to the river. By this time, the word had got out on the town, in the little town of Bynum. It's about 300 people in the nearby vicinity of Bynum. And there's like 30 or 40, country guys sort of leaning a little bit towards redneck down there. The gate was hanging out wide open. That cut lock was hanging off, dripping off the side of the hasp. And I get down there to where the river, where the dog actually is, and all these fellas lined up. There is a bass boat on a trailer that has been dragged down the river trail. That old highway that went to the ferry landing. And all these boys, they got on baseball caps. And they're doing what my mama calls what a man kind of talk. And what a man kind of talk means, there's 3 or 4 country guys get together, and they take their hat off, and they don't, with the same hand, they reach up and they scratch the top of their head with one of their fingers, holding the bill of their cap, usually sticking straight up like a cock's feathers. And they walk around whatever they need to figure out. And Mr. Morgan, I'm going to go out of pain here. They'll walk around whatever they're thinking about, and they'll look at it, whether that's like rebuilding a car engine or, maybe like putting a deck on a house or, something foolish like, whether they should go to Hardee's for supper or get some Burger King. And Taco Bell's a big hit too. But anyway, they'll scratch their head and they'll say, well, you know what? Reckon a man could rebuild that engine right there. You reckon a man could, if I just get some head gaskets and some pistons rebored and some this done and that done and a piece of yes over yonder. I know that fella up there at the machine shop at the plant, and he's a miracle worker. But you reckon a man, and they'll put that hat back on, says, reckon a man could get that piston rebored. We could save that engine right there. So, and there'll be 3 or 4 of them, and one next to him, he'll take his cap off. Maybe he'll use this hand. He'll take his cap off, and he's a center finger kind of guy. He'll walk around. They scratch different depending on which finger they use. Well, I don't know if reckon a man could do that or not. And he'll put his hat back on, and they'll go to the third one. The third one's, well, you know what? I reckon a man could probably do that right there. I believe, I know Johnny up there at the plant. I do believe he could rebore that engine. Well, these 20 or 30 country guys are out there on the side of the river with the dog barking like crazy, with a bass boat on a trailer, 4 or 5 or 12 pickups down there, and they're all standing there looking across the river at the dog, talking to each other, going, well, you reckon a man could do this, and you reckon a man could do that. Hats going on and off, reckon a man this and reckon a man that. My mama says my dad would walk around something like a tractor that needed new tires or what. He would walk around, and him and his buddies would reckon a man talk for 3 hours, and they could have already went to the store and got new tires and put them on the tractor and had the field half plowed by the time the reckon the man talk would be over. And the thing about the reckon a man, this is a fine point that y'all might not have noticed if you're not familiar with reckon a man talks. The fine point is when the reckon a man talk is over and they figure out what a man should a reckon to do, they'll take their hats off one last time and scratch their head and pull that cap back down on their head. I mean, it is locked on, that cap is, and they'll square up that bill. When that cap goes down tight on that head and it's squared up with the bill, that means all the talking is done. It's time for the country boys to go to work. Well, they're out there. In the midst of this, Marilyn Ellis shows up. Marilyn Ellis is a delightful woman that lives in Bynum. She grew up in Bynum. She said that day that her and her dad used to come in on the other side of the river and fish on the back side of that island. She says, well, I believe that they probably could get to the island across the rocks on the other side of the river. Me and my daddy used to go fishing there all the time. And she said that about 12 or 14 times. Well, them fellas over there reckoning the man didn't listen to her once. One of them finally popped up and said, you know who we need? You know what we need? We need Eddie. We need Eddie with his winch. They didn't say, didn't say winch. They said winch. A winch is this thing that sits on the front bumper of most country smart, higher on the totem pole country boy trucks bumpers. And it's this motor, and when they throw the differential thing, whatever, it's like all of the engine power in a Ford 450 or a Chevy Silverado or whatever kind of pickup truck you got, depending on where you're a Mopar man or a Ford man or a GMC Jimmy kind of guy, whatever, when you throw that differential, that all of the engine power, instead of going to the four wheels of the four-wheel drive, it gets kicked right to that engine, that motor on that winch that's mounted out on the front bumper, the extra deluxe super heavy duty front bumper. And it's got a wire that's hooked to a spindle, and that spindle either spins out or rolls up, and at the end of that long wire is a hook. It's like, what they use on ships to like tow barges with the tugboat. They'll hang a hook on it and winch it up tight next to the tugboat and go up the river with the barge. Well, same principle, but we're talking about a Ford 450 pickup truck. And so nobody can get a cell signal. I, of course, hand them my Kyocera 630. And Marilyn Ellis actually makes the call. And she's like, that's right, Eddie. That's where we're at. That's right. We need you, and we need you right now. I don't care. Tell Tiffany we need her too. Tell her to get her face on, get her hair done, and get on down here because we need you now. Nobody don't ever turn down Marilyn Ellis. No. No. And it wasn't no more than about 10 minutes. You hear it off in the distance coming down the river. Boom, 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 boom. And the most hugest Jeep pickup truck I have ever seen in my life comes down that little narrow 8-foot wide river trail. Boom, 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 boom. And there's a winch on the front of it. Oh my gosh, that thing is about this big. I can't do it with both. It's like that big. And Eddie, he stops the truck. He gets out. He's got his cap off. And he goes, well, reckon what a man should do here. And all the boys gathered around. They didn't even have to take their caps off because them bills was already on and they was down tight. And Eddie's like, well, that sounds like that's what I reckon a man should do. Reckon it is. And he puts his cap back on. And he climbs back up in that seat of that pickup truck. He revs that engine up. And he turns that truck straight into the river. And it had been raining for hours. And the river was rising, and he puts the nose end of that truck right down on the water. Actually, the edge of the winch bumper was right, like actually was lapping in the waves. And he kicks something, and he steps out of the pickup truck and closes the door with the window rolled down, and he's like, get on over here, Tiffany. I need you to run this thing. And I then noticed this tiny little petite brunette in the front passenger seat. And she had her hair all, pwned up in front, looked like a corn pone. Her hair's all pwned up in front. There's been a lot of teasing going on, a lot of Aquanet hairspray. She got her makeup on. She is absolutely perfect. 3-inch nails, absolutely beautiful shade of precious pink. Absolutely just gorgeous. Just gorgeous little bitty tiny Tiffany. And she climbs over the console and gets in the driver's seat. And she's sitting there with her little foot, her very well clad foot, I think her shoes even matched, on the gas pedal. And Eddie, the other boys, they've put the boat in the water. They hook that hook off the winch on the end of that wire onto the front end of that boat, and 3 guys climb in, including Harley's owner, dad, whatever. Well, I'm going to call him his dad because that man loved that dog, that deputy sheriff that had, supervised cutting of a bolt off in the state park gate on a Friday afternoon. And it is getting darker by the minute. The rain's still coming down. The river's still coming up. 3 guys are in the bass boat. The dog's still out there barking and barking and barking and barking. And you can hear the 450 truck. Boom, 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 boom. When the boat gets situated, the passenger in the boat, passengers in the boat get situated. Eddie, he gets himself situated. He got one hand up on his hip, almost leaning on that truck, but not quite. And Miss Tiffany with her foot on the gas pedal, and he's going, all right, Miss Tiffany, rev her on up there to 45,000 RPM. And gentle as she go, girl, gentle as she goes. Real slow now, just bring her on up to 45,000 RPM. And Miss Tiffany, she's as slow as she goes. Perfect technique. She revs that engine up, and that wire starts rolling off the front of that winch, and that boat gets caught in the river current and starts heading downstream. Now, these fellas, they were real smart, real country smart. They didn't put in directly across the river from the island. They put in catty corner, upriver. So when the river current catches them, it actually pulls them downstream. And in that midst of that, they're going with the motor wide open on the bass boat and taking everything they got with the bass boat and paddling on the side to get, instead of going straight downstream, to go angled across so they end up on the island with the winch wire still attached. Well, poor Dodo. Poor Dodo, he'd been over there barking, we don't even know how long. He'd been out in the wild for 3, 5 days, 6 days, whatever. And he wasn't having nothing to do with these rednecks. So he immediately goes and tries to hide in the trees, and the boys are over there, and you can see them stumbling. There's trees falling across the river. There's poison ivy like the size of a man's arm. There's, mud holes and rocks and trash and garbage and all. I mean, this was not a habited island. It was just like a river raft. It caught a bunch of like river garbage. It had come downstream, including like big old huge trees they were knocked over, and they were having to scramble over. And the dog goes to one side of the island, goes to the other side of the island, and he's still barking, but mostly. And then he realizes, oh, this is a game. So then he really starts having fun, and he's jumping over the trees back and forth. And it's getting darker, and it's still raining, and the river's still rising, and Eddie's still standing over there with his hand on his hip, and Tiffany, perfect technique, has got her toe perfectly perched on that gas pedal, ready to rev her up whenever she needed to. And finally, the fellas corral Harley, bless his heart, Dodo, around, and get him out to the end of the island. The dog is going to have to go by one of them if he gets loose. The other thing that Harley Dodo could do, and he's not real bright, he could have actually jumped in the river. And the fellas standing on the bank, they're just about salivating. They're so excited. The people from Bynum, the spectators, we were just about salivating because it was so exciting. Marilyn Ellis is giving me a running commentary. You know what? That Eddie's crazy. I'm married to Marty. Y'all don't tell Marty I told this. I'm married to Marty, and Marty's crazy. I thought he was the craziest man on earth. He ain't. That Eddie's crazier than Marty Ellis is. To give you a point of reference, one day I was standing in Bynum on Dan Blanchette's porch with Dan Blanchette beside me, also not a country boy. And Marty Ellis goes up the road on the back tailgate of a pickup truck with his arms spread out wide, and there was a heaping pile of firewood in the bed of the pickup truck, higher than the pickup truck cab, with a tarp over it, and 2 little pieces of rope across the back. And Marty Ellis is going up Bynum Hill with his arms spread out, standing on the back of the tailgate, trying to hold the firewood on the back of the truck. But his claim to fame is he has every power tool known to man and womankind. and I lust after his power tools. And I turned to Dan Blanchett as Marty goes by. We just observed this, tableau, this parade, the firewood, and Marty on the back of and I turned to Dan Blanchett and I said, I want him to be the father of my children. Dan just about pushed me off the porch. And then he took his cap off and he didn't scratch his head. He beat me with it. And he said, you're sick. You're just sick. Love you, Dan. Oh, okay. So where was I in the story? All right, so they get Harley down to the end of the island. And Harley has a choice. Stay put, jump in the river, or stand still and get caught. And at that moment, he decided, the game's been fun. This little adventure's been exciting. Maybe not all fun, but it's been exciting. But I think I like that guy right over there. And so he did probably one of the most brilliant things he had ever done in his little short, stupid life. He let the deputy sheriff fella pick him up. And so, it was like, a woman that had lost her child and had found him. And he was so happy to see that dog. I swear he almost cried. And they go back up to the bass boat. They get in. He's holding on to Harley with everything he's got. Come to find out, Harley was emaciated, dehydrated, covered with ticks, but he ended up being okay. And they get in the bass boat. Now it's Tiffany's time to shine again. Eddie, the man in charge, he's like, all right, Tiffany. We want to come back slow, real slow, because we don't want the front end of the boat to dip down in the water to get scooped up with the bow. Tiffany took all that in. Says, real slow now, slow and easy as you go, girl. River up to about 15,000 RPM. So sure enough, and she held her steady at about 15,000 RPM. I thought, oh man, there's all these boys here, all these baseball cap, a whole lot of testosterone. And the woman in charge is named Tiffany. But the thing is when the boat got out into the channel of the river, the islands down here, the truck with the winches up here, and when the boat got out in the middle of that river channel, the river, even though the fellows was going as hard as they could with the Evinrude motor on the back and paddling on the side, with Harley still being held on tightly by his daddy, the river current caught that boat and it took it downstream and kind of slammed it up against the bank about 150 yards down yon way. And the problem is it's really getting dark. The river is really getting up. And Eddie's truck is actually getting to the point where the water was up to the tires in the front. And Tiffany still got her toe on that 15,000 RPM. And the river trail at that point in time, just below the ferry spot, the swimming hole, there's a bunch of big boulders that have washed out. Where the dirt's washed away, there's a couple big boulders. There's trees across it. You have to cut back and switch back 3 or 4 times to continue. The old pre-Civil War road is less evident. And even with Eddie's 4-wheel drive truck, there was no way they could get downriver to get that boat out at where it came ashore. So 20 or 30 country boys, muscle, they get down there. Tiffany holds the wire taunt, and they holler up the hill, upriver, and when they say go, Tiffany guns that winch and yanks it, and they, every single one at one time, lift that boat up out of the river. Harley's owner, went ahead and got on out of the boat and got out of the way. The fellows, so it was just the boat, but they didn't want to lose the bass boat, didn't want to leave it down there on the river till they could hack a path to get the winch down to it. So they took it up a bank that was about 10 feet at a probably 45-degree angle, straight up. And They between the winch and the country guys, they got it. And then they toted it that 150 yards back up there to the trailer. They put it on the trailer. The trailer did a perfect 3-point turn. That is an artistry in itself if you've ever driven a trailer. They did a perfect 3-point turn in an 8-foot wide river trail, and the truck with the bass boat went on up the hill. The fellow with Harley gets in his truck and drives out, and there is Eddie and Tiffany. And Tiffany is slow as she goes, winding that winch hook back up. It was coming up the river. You could see it grabbing, and every once in a while it would grab a big old handful of like sticks or logs or pieces of stuff, and one of them fellows with a baseball cap on would climb down in there and pull all that garbage out. Tiffany would have to hold up on the gas pedal, and Eddie would say, "All right, Tiffany, river on up there, about 15,000 RPM." And Tiffany would rev that engine on up, that hook. We could just barely see it because it's getting darker and darker. The river's getting deeper and deeper. And finally, they work that hook all the way back up to the truck that's still nose deep down in the water. And Tiffany scoots over. Eddie reaches up and hooks the winch hook on the front bumper of the extra duty, heavy duty deluxe bumper, and he climbs back up into that big old gigantic Jeep pickup, and he does a little gizmo thing with the differential, and all of a sudden that Jeep is backed straight up off that riverbank, and he didn't even slow down. He backs it up off that riverbank, does a quick turn, and he's aimed towards Bynum, upriver. And him and Tiffany head off into the sunset. It was one of the most fascinating things I've ever seen in my life, bar none.